Hello, fifth graders, and welcome to your lesson on colonial regions. We've already introduced each colony by itself, but now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the regions of colonies. First things first, though, here's our standard that we will be learning about today. It is compare characteristics of New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. Today, we're going to be learning all about how each region of colonies shared similarities as well as differences, what their social orders were like, who was at the top of the chain and who was at the bottom of the chain, and then also what their climates were like and how their economies functioned. Let's review which colonies were a part of each region first. The New England colonies consisted of New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. The Middle colonies consisted of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And finally, the Southern colonies, which were Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Starting off with the New England colonies. These were the first to be established, with the first permanent settlement at Plymouth Colony, which eventually became a part of Massachusetts. Here, the King of England granted land to colonists in order for these colonies to perform business functions. Essentially, they wanted them to make goods that they could not make in England, send those back to England in exchange for tools and other things that they could not make in the colonies. These colonies were run by a central government, which gave land to groups of colonists, and these groups of colonists created smaller towns. These towns had sort of town hall meeting places where they could make laws and decide on how the colony should be run. Each town was essentially free to govern themselves as long as they accepted that the central government had more of the power and the King of England had the ultimate power. Here they were strictly run on Puritan views, which caused many non-Puritans to leave the region. And then their major resources were fish, whales, and forest. Moving on to the Middle colonies. These were also known as breadbasket colonies. Their soil was very rich here, which allowed them to sell a lot of grain back to England, back to other American colonies, and also to colonies run by other nations. Here, they were a lot more tolerant of religious views, a lot more welcoming than the New England colonies, and they were a lot more diverse. They housed Dutch, Scots, Irish, Quakers, and many more types of people and religions. Business was big in the Middle colonies. Craftsmen and merchants who made their own items and sold them. Some of these goods were traded across the Atlantic for slaves, but not all. Because of these businesses, though, it became a very prosperous region. The only downside were smugglers who tried to avoid different sorts of taxes, and also thieves who came to raid these businesses at night. And then here, their major resources were timber, furs, coal, and iron ore. And finally, we have the Southern colonies. The weather was a lot warmer here than the Middle and New England colonies, which allowed for a much longer growing season or farming season. Because of this, large plantations developed, which were essentially just large houses and farmlands. They were agriculture focused. They were self-sufficient, meaning they grew what they needed to eat and they made what they needed to make, such as clothes and furniture. They employed some indentured servants, which were essentially people who moved from England with the specific purpose to work and pay off their debts. Once they were done paying off their debts, they were allowed to work for money or start their own farm or plantation. Eventually, though, there were not nearly enough servants to go around on these plantations, so they did have to turn to slaves. Because of the large plantations, there was no need for large cities, so they mainly just had plantations and other port towns such as Charleston, South Carolina. These colonies acted as a barrier between the more northern American colonies and the Spanish colonies down in Florida. And their major resources were tobacco, rice, cotton, and indigo. Here is a general overview of each region of colonies and some of their differences. New England's climate was cool, did not have as much of a growing season, and unfortunately, due to the lack of advancements in medicine, the cold weather did kill a lot of colonists. Middle colonies were much more suitable for living, temperate, warm summers, cold winters, and then, of course, the southern colonies were very warm and moist, and unfortunately, diseases really grew in this sort of climate. So the middle colonies would have been the most ideal to live in. As far as economies go, the New England colonies relied heavily on shipbuilding and fishing, but there were some small farms as well. The middle colonies relied on farming and commerce, as I said, those big businesses that boomed in the middle colonies, which did have a few slaves, but not many, and they participated in a lot of fur trade. The southern colonies, again with the large plantations, cash crops like tobacco and rice, used a lot of slaves and did not have large cities, but they did have some port towns. And then as far as society goes, New England had the strong sense of Puritan faith, specifically a strong ideal of family. They also housed some of the first public education institutes and colleges. And then the middle colonies were much more tolerant and diverse. They accepted a lot of religions, but they did have more of a social order, putting merchants and businessmen, sort of people, at the top, and then sailors and those who did not have a particular trade more towards the bottom of the social order. And then the southern colonies, again, plantation owners controlled their own plantations, their slaves, their workers. The wealthy were able to send their kids to private schools, but the more poor farmers were homeschooled and their children were homeschooled as well. So that is a general overview of each region of the colonies. I hope that this gave you a better insight into what time was like back then, and I hope you enjoyed learning more about the colonies. Bye.